Right, sorry about that. We're now live on YouTube. It took a
Excellent.
little bit of time to get there. Can you all
Well
hear
done.
me?
Well
Yes.
done. So I think, yeah, we can hear you well, Matt. I'm not sure about the YouTube bit, but Ran, you can hear him, right?
Yep.
Lovely,
Good.
good. So we're now live on YouTube. Sorry, that took a bit of time.
No problem. So guys, I think we should start almost right away, if that's okay with everyone. So welcome back again to the Wrightington Supper meetings. They've been excellent so far. Great feedback from everyone. What we'll do is we'll start off with Matrix. We only have one speaker today, and Matt's going to be speaking on biomaterials. He has a higher degree on the subject, so I'm sure we are in for a treat this evening. So Matt, without further ado, do you want to take over and share your screen?
That's great, Sumit. Thanks very much. So I think I've got the short straw. I've got an evening of materials for you guys. So I'll go through quite a few slides, and then we'll be able to hopefully do some MCQ questions at the end. So Ran and Sumit, can you see my screen? Are we working? Good stuff. Lovely. So I'm Matthew Ricks. I'm one of the upper limb consultants at Wrightington, and I'm going to cover materials, properties, and the dreaded StressStrain Graph for the exam in particular. So let me see if I can get this working. Good. So why do you need to know material properties? So it can come up anywhere in the exam. Basic science in particular can come up anywhere in the MCQs to the Viva portion, and it can come up in any aspects where they're asking you about total hip replacement or a failure of metalwork or even a reaction to a metal hip. Anywhere in the exam it can come up with testing your knowledge of materials. So you need to understand what we're putting into patients and also how they fail and to choose the correct implant for the correct job. This is all based upon our knowledge of the materials that we have. So what are we going to cover in an hour? So, well, probably about 45 minutes, is common materials in orthopedics, properties of these materials, and when asked about these materials, hopefully you'll have something to say about each of them, but also you'll have an understanding of their properties and why you're using them, in particular in certain situations. You will go through the StressStrain Graph. We'll start off simple, we'll build up and look at certain areas for it. Then we'll also look at graphical representation of different properties as well, because you're commonly asked to draw these during the exam. Now your StressStrain Graph is commonly asked to draw through the exam and take the examiner through it as well. So kick off with, what are metals? Metals are crystalline structures. An alloy is a combination of elemental metals. There are millions of grains made up into lattices. They add certain other metals to the alloy for certain reasons. So you add nickel or chromium to adhere the corrosive resistance to the material implant that you're doing. You add cobalt to increase the strength. The common metal crystalline arrangements are body-centric cubic, as you see down the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, where each atom is in contact with 8 atoms. Face-centric cubic, where each atom is in contact with 12 atoms. And hexagonal close-packed, where each atom is in contact with 12 atoms. So this is the basic structure of common metals. And your answer would be, it's a crystalline structure of a combination of alloys and different metals. You can get defects within these metals as well. The 3 main defects are grain boundaries, dislocations, and cracks. And you do need to know a little bit about these, because these can lead to imperfections and failure of the metal at points below than they should do. So your grain boundaries are connections between the crystals. The crystalline structure is not continuous across the whole of the metal itself, and therefore the connections between these crystals are a defect site of weakness in the material itself. The dislocations, these are defects within the individual crystals, and one lattice stops abruptly before another one begins. And under stress, these dislocations can propagate and therefore lead to failure of the material. And cracks, these are volumetric voids, is your proper answer to it, within the crystals, and you can get propagation of these cracks as well. So one of the most commonest materials used in orthopedics is your 316L stainless steel. Okay, now, if you use the term 316L, it indicates that hopefully you know what the composition of it is. And now you'll be commonly asked, what is the composition of stainless steel? Because it's not just iron. As I said before, it's an alloy. So therefore, they've added certain other materials into it, or metals, to adhere certain properties to it. So this iron makes up 60% of stainless steel 316L. Chromium makes up 20%. Molybdenum makes up 3%. Nickel is 16%. So the nickel is quite high. So if you have a nickel allergic patient, then stainless steel may not be the ideal implant for them. Now, carbon itself makes up only 0.03%. And this is because the L indicates low carbon, because carbon makes the metal brittle, and it's important to be low in orthopedic materials. You need to know those values, so it's worth writing them down and memorizing them as well, because it can come up in the MCQ, but also it can come up in the Viva exam as well. Now, as we work through the properties of stainless steel, so it's very good with fatigue resistance. So if you've got an implant that's going to be constantly loaded, which we'll explore later on, can potentially fatigue, then you want a material that can hopefully resist this, like a hip replacement. You don't want it failing between the junction between the neck and the step, early on that is. And so you want fatigue resistance. So your stainless steel gives you that. You have a relative biocompatibility, and it has the corrosion resistance as well because of the addition of chromium into it. It's stiff, it's hard, and it's also very cheap to manufacture. That's why it's quite a popular material to use generally, but also in orthopedics as well. And it also remains ductile, which means that you can also contour the plates or bend them to accommodate your fractures or your bone shape as well. Titanium is commonly used, and if you use the term titanium 64, which is the most common alloy of it, this means that you hopefully have an understanding of the other metals that are included in it. So titanium makes up the majority. 90% of the alloy of titanium 64 is made up of titanium, with aluminium and vanadium making up the other. Aluminium being 6% and vanadium being 4%, hence the 64 following it. And then less than 1% makes up the other. So titanium itself has a closer Young's modulus to bone. So therefore you're going to get less stress shielding and hopefully more stress going through the bone to encourage healing, but also to stop reabsorption of the bone as well. So this is a key factor that we'll explore as we start looking at Young's modulus. It has a high fatigue resistance. Now this is important when you've got an intermedullary nail within a bone, because you will have cyclical loads going through it, which can in turn fatigue the implant. And so it's important whilst the bone's healing that your implant has a good fatigue resistance to allow it to take these loads without failing early. It has a high notch sensitivity, unlike other materials. It has a high corrosive resistance, which is important when in the body as well, because you don't want it breaking down within the body and causing an immune response. It's one of the most biocompatible materials that you can put inside the body itself. One of the stiffest implants that you can put in is cobalt chrome, and this commonly makes up your knee and total hip replacements. Cobalt 60255, again, those numbers indicate the percentage proportions of the alloys within them. So your cobalt makes up 60%, chromium makes up 25%, molybdenum makes up 5% and 10% as others. So the chromium's there not just for the stiffness, but for the corrosive resistance, which is one of the key factors here. And so as an alloy, it's a combination of the elemental metals that are inside it. So it's stiff and hard because the cobalt chromium has a high fatigue resistance, so therefore would be an ideal material to do a total hip replacement of, particularly the neck stem junction, because you're going to have a resistance to the forces going through it. It has a high ultimate tensile strength, which we'll explore about later, and has the low corrosion because of the chromium addition there. And the chromium forms a surface oxide layer, and so therefore it's commonly used within joint replacements. If you imagine the amount of millions of cycles a hip replacement does a year, the fluid around the hip will be circulating around it. So it's important that you have this protective element to it. Cobalt chrome itself can disseminate to the bloodstream, as we've seen with metal and metal hip replacements. So that's a negative aspect of the cobalt chrome. And with these metal and metal patients, we've had to monitor the cobalt and the chromium levels themselves to see. There's also an element of hypersensitivity that patients can get. Even though the nickel element is very low, patients can still have a sensitivity reaction to it. So you need to be aware that with some patients, you can't put a cobalt chrome implant in if they have a high sensitivity to nickel. You need to know a small amount on the manufacturing of metals, mainly because there will be certain questions with definitions, or they will ask you what is casting, what is forging. You don't need to know it in depth, but you do just need to know the definition of them or when they're used. So machining itself is a final process of finishing metal, commonly using a lathe. Casting is with molten metals. You're obviously heating up to the point it melts. You cast it and it cools. Now, when it cools, the properties are fully dependent on the rate of cooling. So that's a key factor of it, because if you don't control the rate of cooling, then impurities can sneak into your metal and you will get an impure metal, but also one that will fail below levels that you want it to. But it is very difficult to control the cooling as well. Okay? Forging itself is probably the commonest method of preparing metals. It's pressure, with shaping of the metal, and then you can ultimately cold or hot work the metal as well. Other heat treatments you have to the metal are annealing, which is commonly used with forging, where you heat above the crystalline temperature, and then this makes the material more ductile, if that's the property of the metal that you're looking for. And quenching, where you immerse it within cold water, which is where the material is made harder. Again, if this is a property that you want with the implant that they're doing, then that's something they'll be doing. Tempering is where you reheat to a lower temperature and you re-quench to make the material less brittle. So as we move on through our common materials in orthopedics, one of these is obviously the polyethylene, which is used in total hip replacements, total knee replacements as a bearing surface, which, as you know, was described by Charnley up at Wrightington, which is where we are, with the total hip replacement. So it's a bearing surface to allow you to hopefully have an articulation with the lowest friction possible. You need to know a bit about polyethylene. You need to know the reoccurring chain, the 2 carbons, 4 hydrogens, and that it is a very long chain that these have, okay? It's made by the Ziegler process. It's where you have ethylene gas, which is polymerized under low temperatures and low pressures. And this in turn produces a polyethylene powder. There are 2 different structures within the polyethylene. This is the crystalline structure, which is 3-dimensional patterns of the chains, and an amorphous region of random chains, which gives more wear resistance with a tendency to cross-linking. So the cross-linking will give you better resistance to wear, and that's a key factor, because there are ways of getting cross-linking which you need to know about as well. How can polyethylene strength be increased? So you increase the number of chains, therefore the density, you increase the cross-linking, you reduce the crystallinity, and through manufacturing and sterilization processes as well. So the one that we commonly use is your ultra-high weight polyethylene. You get an increased chain length and an increased number of chains, an increased amorphous area, giving you an ultimate bearing surface for your implant to hopefully articulate on and give it the lowest wear potentials and hopefully the longest longevity of the implant inside the body itself. The other common material that's used is ceramics. So the 2 main types of these are bioinert and bioactive ceramics. And so ceramics are compounds of metallic elements. And most ceramics are structured with either an ionic bond, and some are covalently bonded. And the ceramics themselves have a granular structure. So the bioinert ceramics that are used in orthopedics are alumina, which is the commonest type, zirconia, which is expensive with high fracture rates, and oxinium, which you may have heard some total knee replacements being made of or layered with, which is oxidized zirconia. And so ceramics are made by mixing powdered ceramic and water and pressing them in prefabricated casts. The cast is then removed and heated to a high temperature, and this is known as sintering. And the word sintering is linked to ceramics. So that may be a question in MCQ or may come up in a Viva questioning. And the porosity is affected by the sintering time. So the heating up process and the heat they heat to will affect the properties of the ceramics. And ceramics themselves are chemically inert. So of the bioactive ceramics that are present in the orthopedic materials that we use, commonly this is hydroxyapatite or tricalcium phosphate. These are bioactive osteoconductive ceramics. Now, commonly you see these in total hip replacements, like the Karai hip replacements, layered with a bioactive ceramic to hopefully encourage bone growth into it to provide a stability. This happens throughout quite a few implants in orthopedics that we use, and hopefully it provides a bidirectional bone growth, is what the textbooks say, and allows bone to bond to the material itself and hopefully provide a stable surface, which normally in the hip replacement wise is maintained with a cement. The ceramics themselves have great properties, and the good properties are they're inert, so they're biocompatible, they're stiff, they're hard, they tend to have a very good smooth layer as well. They have a very good scratch profile, and they have very low wear characteristics and less osteolysis because of the wear particles and the wear characteristics. Now, the wear aspect of it is that not only the scratch profile, but also the material itself being the articular bearing surface, but it does have bad properties. And this can be that they're brittle, weak in tension, and expensive. And one of the big factors with a total hip replacement is the squeak. So some of these patients with ceramic on ceramic can complain of squeaking, which is a side effect of a ceramic on ceramic. Another material that's commonly used in orthopedics is your polymethyl methacrylate. So you do need to know a bit about this for the FRCS examination, and you need to know classically what makes up the liquid and what makes up the powder, because these are the two factors that could come up in an MCQ question, because it shows you understand the components of it and hopefully the reaction that occurs, because it is a reaction that you're putting through in first in your vacuum container, and then as you put it into the patient, the process occurs and the cement will go off, and so something occurs there. It's important you have an understanding of it. So PMMA is a bone cement. Actually, it's a grout. If someone was to grill you on it, it's not a cement, but we commonly call a bone cement. It comes as a liquid and a powder. When it mixes, it creates an exothermic reaction. So when you're molding in your hands, you can feel the heat giving off. Okay, and this is important because if you leave cement around a patient, it can cause burns on the skin through the drapes. And so it's important you do take all cement away. The setting time is dependent upon multiple factors, and this is commonly an MCQ question. And so the composition, so the amount of materials in it, the vacuum mixing, so whether you do the vacuum properly, the pressure and temperature. So commonly people say where the powder or where the cement is stored, because the temperature of it can change the actual setting time for it. So it's important you know those factors if you're using it regularly. The liquid contains the monomer, the accelerator, and the inhibitor. So it's important you know these elements that are in the liquid because it's asked about in the MCQ. The powder itself is made up of the PMMA copolymer, barium, which is commonly added to give you a radio opaque view on the X-ray. So when you see it, it looks radio opaque, and that's the addition of barium. Benzyl peroxide is your polymerization initiator. The other factors that are added as well is antibiotics, which is commonly added to them, and chlorophyll in some cases to give you a green appearance. The PMMA properties is they're weak in tensile strength, but we commonly don't use the cement to be used in tensile situations, but more in compression, of which they are very strong in compression. So when you use it in the femur, as you're doing with a total hip replacement, it's cemented in, you will hopefully be loading through compression, and therefore putting the cement through is probably the stresses that will be strongest to resist. It has moderate resistance to shear. It has a Young's modulus between cortical and cancellous bone, which is good when it comes to stress shielding. So you'll have your very high Young's modulus of your implant, then your cement, the lower Young's modulus, and then coming to your cortical cancellous bone, which will be between. It's brittle, so if you're doing a revision total hip replacement, you know that when you're chiseling through, you can cause crack propagation through it and remove it because it's brittle. It also demonstrates creep and stress relaxation. So there are a couple of common materials that are used in orthopedics. Now moving on to the dreaded StressStrain Graph. So this is an easy way for an examiner to grill you on multiple different aspects of a material and your understanding of materials. And it's a fantastic way of doing it and asking a candidate to draw the strain graph and to talk someone through it. So in my exam, I was asked to draw this and take an examiner through it. So first you have to work out what is stress. So stress is a force applied per unit area. One of the great examples I had about what 1 Pascal is that it's equivalent to an apple on a meter squared coffee table, which is quite good. But the equation you need to know is that stress is force divided by area, okay? Because we'll talk about stress and strain a lot whilst talking about the stress-strain graphs. So what is strain? So strain is an engineering term, and it's a change in length divided by original length. And it's a measure of deformation of a material, and it's expressed as a percentage or ratio, but more commonly as a percentage itself. This is the equation you need to know for strain. You do need to memorize it because there's some situations where you identify an MCQ or you're asked to write it down. And again, it's a change in length or final length minus original length divided by original length. And this is always usually a percentage. So how do they get a stress-strain graph? So they use tensile testing machines. It's materials of a standardized size and shape are placed inside a testing machine. It's loaded through a standardized protocol and it produces your classical stress-strain graph. So why do we need to know this again? Because we are putting materials into patients. We need to know how or which materials to put in that are most appropriate for the jobs we want. Whether we want the stiffest ones, whether we want the ones that are closest to bone from a Young's modulus point of view to hopefully prevent stress shielding, or the most biocompatible. But either way, we need to understand the materials that we're putting in, and particularly the stresses and strains that go through them, so we can hopefully choose the best material. So all material properties are subjected to forces you apply through it. So the isotropic forces and mechanical properties remain the same regardless of the type of force going through it. An anastrophic material is when mechanical properties vary with the type of force applied to it. An example of that would be cortical bone, cancellous bone, while isotropic is classically metals. And therefore it's necessary to use a stress-strain curve to analyze material properties to allow their comparison, and hopefully we'll understand them more. So during examination, you'd probably try and draw something like this, not using color, I'm sure, because you won't have colored pen during the examination, but you need to highlight certain areas and talk through certain areas of the stress-strain graph, showing your understanding of materials. And then hopefully they won't have any questions to ask at the end of it. So the basic stress-strain graph you need is this one. So looking at your y-axis, you have stress, which you have on the left side, and on the bottom portion, you have strain on the x-axis. Okay, you know the equations for both. And this is an example of a stress-strain graph for a common metal, let's say stainless steel. Now, as we look at different aspects of this graph, we'll hopefully be able to draw them during your examination, but also give you an understanding of what it is. So the first thing is the gradient of the initial slope. So this is the Young's modulus, which is the gradient, okay? It's a measure of stress strain. It's always referred to as the Young's modulus. It's a gradient of the initial curve, and it reflects the stiffness of the material. The higher the Young's modulus, the stiffer the material is, and the more energy the material can take. At this point, it's always important to mention Hooke's law, okay? This is that a pure elastic material, stress strain are linear, and that is represented by the steep linear part of the stress strain curve in the elastic region, which is what we've highlighted here with relation to the red portion of it. Now, when it comes to Young's modulus, this is an important factor to know off by heart, and it is important you know the key Young's modulus values for commonly used materials in the body, whether this comes up as an FCQ or whether you're questioning the Viva about it. The hardest is always ceramic when talking about orthopedic materials, and the numbers I've chosen here, if you look through the textbooks, they do vary slightly. These are usually the average or the commonest quoted numbers. And I also think the values that we've chosen here are quite easy to remember as well. So ceramic has the highest Young's modulus of them all, which is 250, and then cartilage is 0.002, which is the lowest Young's modulus value. And you can see as we come through the metals, cobalt chromium has the highest, 225, stainless steel 200, and titanium 100. So if you look at cortical and cancellous bone, they're a lot lower. So cortical bone is 10 times lower than stainless steel. And if you look at cancellous bone, it's only 1. And so you can imagine if you're putting a cobalt chrome implant in and you've got cancellous bone, you're going to have a huge amount of stress shielding because of the mixed match of your Young's modulus values that you have there. Now, it is important to learn these, and there's nothing you can really do apart from just learn the numbers. And commonly they ask you about the metals, and they can ask you about the bone as well. But it shows, if you do know those numbers, that you appreciate the discrepancies in the Young's modulus between the two of them. Because obviously you have a bone, it's easier to break a bone than it is break a metal bar. Okay. Now, a fact that we need to look at underneath the graph is the elastic deformation zone and the plastic deformation zone, as I've highlighted here. The elastic deformation zone is when the material is loaded and unloaded and it returns to its original shape. This is shown in the graph by the dark red portion. Then you move to the right of it and you have the lighter, brighter red, which is your plastic deformation zone. This is when a material is loaded and unloaded and it is permanently deformed and it does not return to its original shape. Now this is important because some materials don't have the ability to plastic deform or have a very small amount of plastic deformation that they do before they fail. As I said before, this is a common stress strain graph for a metal. The example being stainless steel. So we have an area where the metal would deform before failing and fracturing, and so there is a plastic deformation zone. And if you look at a ceramic, it has very little to no plastic deformation zone, and therefore will fail catastrophically earlier on, and does not have the plastic deformation zone as we see here. So between the elastic and plastic deformation zone, there is a yield point, and this is when there's a rapid increase in deformation, which occurs with no increase in strain, and the material becomes permanently deformed beyond this point, i.e. elastic going to plastic deformation zone, which is the yield point. The next point is your ultimate tensile strength, which is known as a UTS, which is the maximum amount of stress that a material can take. It's the highest point on the y-axis with your stress, and you can see that it's also where the material is stiffest and the strongest as well. Another area of the graph you need to know is strain hardening. This is when plastic deformation makes the material stiffer and therefore for a short period before the ultimate tensile strength. And in turn, the Young's modulus actually increases. So this is where the material is changing shape, but the changing shape of the material leads to an improvement of the properties, a higher Young's modulus, and makes it stiffer only for a small period of time before it goes on to failing. So as we come on, you come to the ultimate tensile strength, and then beyond that, you have the necking portion. And this is where plastic deformation and necking or narrowing of the material decreases the stiffness before it fractures. So rather than increasing, as you see in the upward of the curve before UTS, the narrowing portion, the necking portion, you can see a decrease, and therefore the stiffness is going down. And then the X at the end is the fracture point. So this is obviously the failure of the material where it snaps or breaks, and any further stress causes failure of the material from this point. Now, when asked about toughness, toughness is the area underneath the curve. It equates to the area under the whole of the stress strain curve. Okay, it's the total amount of energy that can be absorbed by a material before fracture. What is hardness? So commonly they'll ask you hardness as well with stress strain graphs, although it's a surface property and it's not relevant to stress strain graphs because it's not depicted on the stress strain graph itself. It's the ability of a material to resist surface scratches. So therefore some materials are easier to scratch than others. And another key factor about scratch is the scratch profile as well. So they may have talked about this in the tribiology lectures by the hip guys from the unit. But the crux of the matter is that when a metal scratches, you have the trough in the middle, but you also have the peaks on the outside portion of the scratch. Now, this is different to a ceramic where you don't get those peaks. And these peaks can lead to cleaving through a polyethylene bearing surface or scratching in turn of another bearing surface, and therefore propagating scratches, when a ceramic doesn't do that, so therefore has a better scratch profile than a metal does. So as I come back to the stress-strain graph, we looked at lots of different areas for it. So when you're drawing it, you will draw your y-axis with your stress, your values on it, your x-axis, the strain, mentioning that there's no units to it, but it is change in length divided by original length, and it's represented as a percentage. You will draw the initial curve, the curvature over, and then the fracture point, indicating that this is a common stress-strain graph for a metal, say stainless steel. You will highlight that the gradient of the initial portion where Hooke's law applies, where it's linear, is the Young's modulus, and it does vary between materials. And you can even quote the Young's modulus of materials that you know about. You will highlight the plastic deformation zone, the elastic deformation zone, and you'll also highlight that when an elastic zone goes into plastic, this is the yield point. Now, after the yield point is the strain hardening period, where you get a plastic deformation of the material, but an increase in Young's modulus and stiffness of the implant. The highest point, the maximum amount of energy, is the ultimate tensile strength. And as you come beyond this, you get the necking portion, which is where you get further plastic deformation of the material, but this leads to a decrease in the actual stiffness of the implant, and in turn leads to failure or breaking of the implant, which is marked by the X. The area under the curve is toughness, indicating the ultimate amount of energy that can be reabsorbed by the implant. And then you can mention hardness is not on the stress-strain graph, but is resistance of a material to scratches. Now that hopefully allows you to go through all the stress strain and be able to talk through with an examiner the different areas they're going about, and highlight that you understand the difference between materials. So this is a crude example I drew showing the difference between a ductile material and a brittle material. You can see that the ductile material has a zone of plastic deformation. So therefore, when it takes up load, it goes to the yield point and then is able to plastically deform, taking on more energy. Now, the issue with brittle materials is they don't have this plastic deformation zone. They fail abruptly when they reach this yield point, because they fail like a ceramic would do. Therefore, they can crack because they're brittle, unlike a metal that has the ability to be ductile and change its shape with plastic deformation. This is a crude example of strong versus weak. You can see the length of the line, the size of the line indicates whether the amount of energy, the stress that the implant or material can take, and the one on the right is a lot longer and therefore stronger than the one on the left, which indicates it's a lot weaker. Now, coming to other material properties you need to know, you need to understand creep, fatigue failure, hysteresis, and stress relaxation. They're commonly in a Viva setup ask you to do a graphical representation of these and to explain them to the examiner as well. So the first thing up is creep. So the creep is a time-dependent deformation under a constant load. An example of that in orthopedics is Passetti treatment of club foot, that you put them into the cast with pressure points around to hopefully lead to molding, to hopefully change over time the shape of the foot. And that's an example of creep, or as this was, a glacier moving down a mountain. And the key factor is your X and Y axes do change. Your Y axis is now strain, and your X axis is time. And the other factor to add when talking about creep is that the material is subjected to a constant load. It's not a cyclical load, it's not an increasing load, it is a constant load, and therefore the only thing that's changing is time. And so with time, it changes shape. Classically, the picture in the book is on the side of the table with a ruler hanging off a weight, and then the ruler creeps and changes shape over time. And so this is the graph you'll need to know, highlighting the X and Y axes, and that it is under a constant load. So the next factor you need to know about is stress relaxation, because this occurs when you're preparing a femur for implantation of your total hip replacement and other points during your orthopedic procedures. It's important to be able to draw these. So again, y-axis change from your classical stress strain graphs, with your y-axis being stress and your x-axis being time. And this shows that with time, there's a time-dependent reduction in the stress required to maintain the deformation. Okay, an example of this is hoop stresses in a femur or cartilage. Okay, and this is the graph that you draw for stress relaxation. Okay, hysteresis represents the history dependence of physical systems and is a stress strain. So the x-y axes are the same as a stress strain graph, and it's a stress strain curve during the loading and unloading of a material, like tendon. Okay, and the difference in the loading and the unloading is due to energy loss, and commonly that energy loss is heat. Okay, because as you're using the tendons, you can heat up the surrounding tissues because of the mitochondria working and the energy being given off to the surrounding tissue. So that's why you get a difference in loading and unloading with that graph. So what is fatigue resistance? So fatigue resistance is important to know about, because you may see during your practice implants that end up fatiguing and failing. Whenever we put metalwork into patients, usually it's a race, particularly if you fractures, between the fracture healing and the metalwork failing. If the fracture doesn't heal, it's inevitably going to be that the metalwork will fail at some point. An example of this X-ray is, I don't know whether the actual screw may have notched or weakened the nail as it went through, but there is definitely a weak point at the hole where the nail goes through, the screw goes through the nail, and so therefore this fatigued at a point because of cyclical loading through it. And whether this is because the fracture didn't heal, or because the weight was too much, or there was too many cycles, but all of this occurred before it was able to heal. So this failed by fatigue at a common point. So the thing that you need to draw is the SN curve, which indicates fatigue failure. Okay, so failure of a material caused by repetitive stress, like loading of a femur when walking through it, like that last one with an intramedullary nail, a repetitive stress fails below its ultimate tensile strength. So it doesn't require the maximal amount of stress on that stress strain graph that we've seen before to fail. It fails well below that, and it's dependent upon the number of cycles, and that is represented by the SN curve. The S indicates stress, the N indicates number of cycles. There is a dotted line, which is the endurance limit, and this is the maximal stress at which a material is able to withstand 10 million cycles of loading. So they're the key factors that you point out on a SN curve when talking about fatigue failure. But the crux of this is that if you have an implant that is cyclically loaded with time, then it will fail below its ultimate tensile strength. Another factor that commonly comes up is the difference between stiffness and rigidity. This is two definitions that commonly people get wrong. Now, stiffness is a material property and rigidity is a structural property. And rigidity can be affected by the shape of a material, just like a steel girder has a different structural property to a cylinder or to a rectangular shape as well. Okay. So luckily, we're coming to the end of it now. So material properties for the FRCS. So it's important you know what a metal is, that you can explain what a metal is, the common metals that are used in orthopedics, the common ceramics that are used, the common cement or grout that's used, and be able to discuss them for a couple of minutes, understanding why we use them, good points, bad points. And so therefore the materials you put in, you know why we use them and how to use them. You need to know the Young's modulus values of common metals, materials even as well, because this gives you an understanding of when you should use them in the body in an orthopedic setting. You have to be able to draw the stress strain graph, and the key factor is when drawing it, talk to the examiner about it. Talk about the different areas that you're running through the graph with, and hopefully you'll be able to draw creep, fatigue, stress relaxation graphs for the examiner, and hopefully they'll be able to understand that you have an insight and hopefully a knowledge of orthopedic materials and its properties. And that's it, luckily. So that's the crux of materials. So we've got a series of MCQ questions as well. Firstly, Sumed or Ran, any questions at all that picked up that you want to go through, or?
Yeah, there were a few Q&As, but I think we've answered it. But
Perfect.
I mean, the first one is about NOx sensitivity, but I think that was quite a simple one to answer. And then there was one question about when the material passes its yield point, has become useless. I think we've answered that in private. My understanding for when I revised my FRCS is that in some instances, actually reduce a Young's modulus so it's closer to that of biological cortical bone. Is that the case, or is that a misconception?
You're absolutely right. And so there's certain places for certain materials in the body, and when you mix match them and you get it wrong, the result can be catastrophic. So the example of that is using a cobalt chrome in a cancellous bone, and therefore you have such a mixed match of stress shielding that you're going to get a huge reabsorption of the bone. With Wolff's law, as we know, is bone remodeled with forces going through it. And so if you get the mixed match wrong, then it can be disastrous and it doesn't heal, or you'll get a resultant fracture around it. But yeah, any other questions at all?
I think one just popped up from an anonymous attendee asking a stress strain curve for different bone pathological disorders, so osteoporosis, osteomalacia, Paget's, whether we need to know that. So
I like the way none of you answered that as well, Ran and Sumed. That is a nasty question if you're asked that.
In fairness, it's only just come up, but I would have passed on that.
To be honest, I would probably struggle for that. Now, the key factor with osteoporosis, as you know, is the porosity changes, and therefore it's probably going to be brittler with less ability to plastically deform. So if you were to talk about that, I think that would be one point. Paget's as well, the structure of the bone changes, and I imagine the plastic deformation zone, but I won't be able to draw those for you myself, and I don't think they'd ask you that in exam. But it all changes the properties of the bone, yes, and it would probably affect the plastic deformation zone, but also lead to an earlier failure of them, which we know occurs with osteoporotic type fractures. Shall I start running the polls?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
All right.
Why don't you go ahead?
Lovely. So this is the first question. So what is the Young's modulus of stainless steel? So this is commonly one of your MCQ questions. It's easily done as you're sitting there in your driving center doing your 300 questions. Okay, good. We're getting a number of votes. Good. We'll end that. Share results. Good. So I think majority of you are right. 200 with stainless steel. It's a good reference point to have. You know, cobalt chrome's higher, you know, titanium's lower. Remember stainless steel, and then you can guess the others if you don't know that. Let's see if we've got our next one. Nope, that's not it. I wasn't giving you another go. That's by accident. Here we go. So second one. So what is the definition of Young's modulus? Is it the area under the initial part of the curve? Is it the gradient of the initial part of the curve, the length of the initial part of the curve, or the height of the initial part of the curve? Okay, we'll end that. So that shows majority of you are correct, 90% the gradient of the initial portion of the curve. Okay. Question 3. What is the toughness, or what is toughness? Is it the area under the curve? Is it the ability of a material to resist scratches? Is it the highest point of the curve? Or is it the point between the elastic and plastic deformation zones? Okay, we'll end that. So it showed 86% had the area under the curve, which is correct. The ability of a material to resist scratches is the hardness, which is talked about. The highest point of the curve is the ultimate tensile strength. The point between elastic and plastic deformation zones is the yield point. 4. What is a Young's modulus of tendon? See how many of you are actually paying attention. Cool. We'll end that. So it shows majority 53% were right, so it's 0.1. Easy to make the mistake. Cartilage below it 0.002, and just above it on my graph was cancellous bone with 1. So that's right. Question 5. What is the definition of stiffness? Now, I talked about this a lot, but I may not actually mention the definition of it. The maximum amount of energy material can absorb. The point at which a material goes from elastic to plastic deformation. I seem to use that one quite a bit. The ability of a material to resist deformation. The ability of a material to resist stress. Good. So it's the ability of a material to resist deformation. Coming on to number 6. What is the main reason of adding chromium to a metal alloy? So it's used throughout orthopedics. And why would you add it? Now it does infer other properties, but the main reason you add it is what 92% of you said, improve corrosion resistance, which is correct. Number 7. What is the percentage composition of iron in 316L stainless steel? Okay. And 80% of you said 60%, which is correct. So iron 60%. So that's it. So I'll see if I can share results. Lovely. So therefore we've gone through the questions. Any other questions that have come up? No? Rand, do you have anything to say to everyone before we call to a close?
No, I mean, this is great. I wish I saw this before my exam, because I searched through the web and orthotics and everything, and this is an excellent summary of what you need to know. I think one thing to be aware is often the questions may not come as direct as draw me the stress strain curve. So you might need to, so if you sat there and it's sounding like a non-basic science station, just remember, rely on your basics, and there are fundamental things that they're testing, and you can use that to answer the tricky ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And also basic science can come up anywhere, from MCQs to Vivas, talking about total hip replacements to fractures that haven't healed, and they can ask you about it. We're quite keen to have any feedback on areas that you guys want to do. Obviously, basic science is a massive area, and if you want us to talk to you for an hour about bone, we can do. We can do anything that you want to do. Just feedback to Ran, and then we'll feedback to Mike and us, and we're happy to do anything that you want to do. Yeah. Particularly boring areas that most people struggle with. Materials, you know, I did a degree in it, God knows how, but it's hard to talk about it for an hour and keep people interested. I think I had a couple of attendees drop out. Don't blame them. We had quite a few stay on.
Matt, we've got 2 questions there. Can you see those? So there's one from Vishesh about the differences between rigidity and stiffness. Do you want to take that?
Yep. So it's about the property. So stiffness is a material property, which we've shown in our stress strain graphs, and rigidity is a structural property. So commonly people use rigidity when they mean stiffness as material property. But when you're talking about rigidity, you use it in the term of a larger material sense. So therefore your shape of your material comes into it. Because as we said before about the stress strain graphs, they're based upon a uniform shape of a material in a machine that's being tensile tested. The rigidity does not apply to that. It applies to the overall shape of a material, because a steel girder has a different structural properties to a similar amount of iron or metal that is made in a cylinder. So the shape of it does have a huge impact. This is why when you're building huge skyscrapers, you use steel girders and not rectangular slabs of metal, because the rigidity is impacted upon the shape of the actual material itself.
Then there's one more, Matt, the last one.
So mismatching titanium, you know, the interesting thing about titanium is that quite a few of our implants, you know, are made out of it because the Young's modulus is closer to bone of 20. You know, 100 to 20 is better than 200 to 20, and therefore the stress shielding is less. You get more bone remodeling to the bone, less bone reabsorption, which hopefully in turn will lead to less bone being reabsorbed as a key factor. So if you use stainless steel, then you're going to have a higher Young's modulus, so bigger discrepancy between the two of bone, and therefore you'll get stress shielding. But it also comes down to cost. Stainless steel is so much cheaper than titanium.
And then hardness and stiffness, any relation or correlation?
Oh, I couldn't answer that one. That's probably the master's level. I missed that day.
Easy one at the end.
Right, I thought I answered most questions. Lovely.
We can't answer it. What can I say? So just a quick issue about the FRCS Auth. We started that course about 10 years ago with Tim Ward. And the plan is to reinstate it again starting September, obviously with social distancing and masks and infection control and everything. So they've absolutely buried me with paperwork at this moment in time. And once we do manage to jump through all the hoops, I suspect that the advice from the government is going to change. But you know, keep watching the website. The September course is oversubscribed because we've had to reduce numbers. But going forward in January, if we manage to get ourselves a slightly bigger venue for the purposes of social distancing, we'll probably use Zoom. I've spoken to attend anyway, you know, for the purposes of clinical examination. So we'll have demonstrations of clinical examinations with the examiner and the patient, rather than you actually touching a patient. So, you know, say you take rheumatoid hand or brachial plexus, things like that in a concentrated period of time, including things like prosthetics, nerve conduction tests, and other niche topics going forward. So I'll let you know how things go. The problem with the courses is that they get filled up very, very quickly. So make sure that you log in and get hold of Jackie Richardson, who runs the courses. So Matt has been volunteered to take over from me at some point. And hopefully I'll find a volunteer for the basic sciences as well. Yeah. So that's brilliant. We've had
just one more thing. Obviously, I guess a lot of the attendees will be pre-exam and or have their exam coming up very soon. There is a RCS Edinburgh webinar on Monday, so tomorrow at 7 p.m. with updates of the FRCS exam. It's very important that people that are coming up to the FRCS exam tunes in, because there are some quite big changes happening as a result of COVID, and it's important that you know of these early rather than later, and you'll have a chance to ask questions about that as well tomorrow, 7 p.m.
Excellent. Okay, so I think that concludes Sunday supper. I'm not sure what the schedule is yet, Matt, for next week, but I'm sure we will think of something. We've got one on rheumatoid hand. I've got a patient who's kindly volunteered, so it sort of depends on her availability as well, because it's all in the examination of a rheumatoid hand, I think. And stay in touch. We might take a little bit of a back burner during August when people are on leave. But rest assured, we'll let you know. And well done, Matt. That was a great talk.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks for logging in, Ram.
Thanks everyone for coming.
See you.